A very good morning, dear students. The topic that I'm going to take up for discussion in this particular lecture video is that of the role of ethics in international business. As we all understand, when businesses start growing internationally, they are moving out of their domestic boundaries, moving out of their respective business environments that govern business activities in their particular country. They move to different countries of the world where those countries are governed by their own respective business environments. So when we talk about business environments, we're not just talking about the pestle forces, we're also talking about the ethical environment or the ethical climate that's prevalent in those particular countries. Now, ethical environment is very important because all business activities and all business decisions that a particular firm has to take or has to make in its interactions with all the various stakeholders, right from dealing with the government and the government officials, dealing with suppliers, customers, dealers, and other set of businesses in the supply chain will largely depend on the ethical environment that's prevalent in that particular country. So let's say, for example, giving a bribe or accepting a bribe could be okay in certain countries of the world. It could be a certain business practices such, right? But it may not be the same in many countries of the world. So that's where business activities, especially when companies are going from a particular country, let's say for example, a particular country where giving, bribing, and doing and getting into corrupt practices is a very acceptable thing, and nobody really bothers much about it in that particular society. So when this particular company goes to another country which is not so corrupt, and then they tend to do whatever they have been doing in their country, and then they try bribing, or then they try you know implementing those corrupt practices that they were using in their particular country. Now that could backfire for them when they go into those countries, because those countries will could have codes of conduct or could have ethical principles that govern all business activities, and they may take mm, your corrupt practices or actions very seriously, and they can go to an extent of blacklisting your company, and also petitioning to the authorities in their governments to ensure that your company is not allowed to do business. So such kind of repercussions are possible when a firm enters into international business. So let's understand what ethics is all about. The word ethics is derived from a Greek word called ethikos, which means customs or character. Ethics basically deals with what is right and what is wrong, right? And this comes from three different aspects of you have morals that tells you what's right and what's wrong, and what is morally acceptable in terms of doing the right thing in dealing with any business situation or dealing with any business activity. Secondly, it can come from ethics, which is the code of conduct in terms of what is right and what is wrong. And thirdly, it could come from values that are developed in a particular society, that is taught and and accepted widely, or is practiced widely in a particular society. So all of these are what are part of a certain upbringing in society among individuals and citizens, and then society at large will tend to practice these particular aspects. So the ethical ways of doing things are very much a part of a society. It is very much a part of our personality, it's very much a part of our attitude and behavior. And so hence, when we are part of a particular society, and then when businesses around us start dealing with certain things, then it becomes a very acceptable practice. But it may not be the same when businesses go international and they go into different countries of the world, which have a zero tolerance for corrupt practices, or zero tolerance for unethical practices. Then that could really put our firms into a lot of difficulty. So let us look at what these issues are and what are the most commonly dealt issues, or commonly common corrupt issues or unethical issues that most international companies face, and how do they go about dealing with it. So we will look at all of that in this particular lecture. So international business ethics attempts to deal with this question of what to do in a situation where ethical morals come into conflict as a result of differing cultural practices. So here, what we need to understand now, when I gave you this example of giving a bribe and accepting a bribe is an accepted business practice, maybe in our country, right? Where both the parties, the party that is giving the bribe or the party that is accepting a bribe, feels that it is okay. It is okay to give certain gifts to your business partners. It is okay to host a meeting and then take care of all the expenses in a very expensive resort. So all of that is an acceptable practice. But when you tend to do the same thing when you go to another country and you're dealing with business partners or clients in those particular countries, and that's where it could be a certain conflict of between what is right and what is practically allowed as part of the culture. So that is when companies get into a particular state called an ethical dilemma, where there is a conflict between what you think you want to do and what is acceptable in that particular country, and it very often may go against certain established business practices and certain value systems that could be there in that particular country. For example, should an international business pay bribes to corrupt government officials to gain market access to a foreign country? Now, this is the way it could be done in your country, and for every interaction that you have with a government official, or if you want to secure licenses, or if you want to secure permits, or anything that you want to do with the government, happens only when you grease their palms, or when you pay them enough bribes, or you give them expensive gifts, and only then your work gets done within a certain reasonable period. Right now, when you go international, do you go with the similar mindset of of assuming that government there, or government officials, or all government officials in all countries are like this, or government officials in that respective country that you're going to are also corrupt, and it is the same thing, we will have to deal with them just the way we deal with officials in our country? So that is when you could be in a ethical dilemma. That is where you could make terrible mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes can go against you and can also be very severe, including blacklisting, and then having and the government of the country deciding to evict you out of that particular country, and let you not do business in that particular country anymore in any further state. So, how and whether is it possible to act ethically at the international level? So, international business ethics has a number of open questions and dilemmas. Today, it is characterized by the following elements. So, is ethics now? There is also a debate that also goes into the understanding of corporate leaders that when you are in business, you're only looking at profit making. So, it does not matter um, when you indulge in unethical practices, or when you indulge in corrupt practices, as long as you are able to reach your goal, as long as you are able to achieve your objectives, as long as you are able to make profits. So that is, on one side you have business leaders and managers having a certain attitude towards corrupt practices and unethical practices. On the other hand, you also have business leaders who set examples by stating that yes, business needs to be done, but there is always a code of conduct in conducting business, and profit making, yes, at the end of the day is the end result, but you can still make profits by being very ethical, because consumers in society or clients in society will always respond positively for those companies, and that those companies that stand for ethical practices, and those companies that do business in the most cleanest manner. So international business is characterized by several characters as such. So there's always been a very uh, conflicting debate about how business leaders and companies look at ethics as such. So some of the elements that we need to understand is every culture and nation has its own set of values, history, customs, and traditions. Thus, it has developed its own ethical values and understanding of ethical principles. So the ethical climate and the ethical environment in that particular country and society is largely shaped by its own history and its own customs and traditions. So that's how a certain corrupt practice that is seen as corrupt in different parts of the world may not be seen as corrupt in those societies. Or paying a bribe may be seen as a corrupt practice, but it may not be seen as a corrupt practice in that particular society. Or gender discrimination when it comes to employment could be seen as an unethical practice in certain other countries, and it may not be seen in your society. So there are several examples of how the same issue at the international level when we do business could be interpreted very differently and could be understood and practiced differently by different societies, and that largely comes from the backgrounds that govern that particular ethical climate, or the background that influences that particular ethical climate, which leads to decision making among managers and leaders. The second element is there is no international ethical code of conduct accepted and followed by all the countries. So there is no common standard in terms of ethics. So it is largely subjective and relative. Every country and every business looks at it from its own end, and they deal with dilemmas and issues from what they think is right at that point of time. Thirdly, there is a lack of government's initiative to create ethical cooperation framework, and thus to enhance ethical behavior in the international business. So, no governments have also been able to show that will or have been able to collectively come together to create an ethical cooperation framework to drive home the point that all businesses will have to adhere to a certain standard of ethics. So when governments themselves have not been able to come together, and the reason being that governments themselves in many countries are corrupt, and so it is very difficult to find, really upright kind of governments, or upright, government officials or governments who are very interested in trying to do that. And hence, since there is nothing of this sort, uh, that's where it's a little difficult as such. But there is one particular body called the Transparency International that every year creates a certain index. It's a ranking of all the countries. It's called the Transparency International. So that goes about creating a particular ranking list called the Corruption Perceptions Index. So in the Corruption Perceptions Index, year after year, they're going to rank businesses, they're going to rank countries on the basis of the most corrupt country and the most cleanest or the most non-corrupt country of the world. So accordingly, ranks are given. So there are about 180 countries that the corruption perception index of 2019 that was put forth by Transparency International. I mean, it's available in the Transparency International website. It ranks India at 41, right? So if you see on globally, you will find Canada. You will find Canada. You will find all the countries above Canada, most of those countries closer to the Arctic, and United States of America, and then a few of the countries in Scandinavia, in and those countries like Finland. Those are countries that are the least corrupt, or the most cleanest kind of countries where you can do business. A majority of the countries, when you see majority of the countries are corrupt. It's just that they are in varying degrees. The most corrupt countries in the world are mostly spread out in the Asian countries. Um, Mostly countries, most corrupt countries in Asia, a few countries in Latin America, a few countries in the African continent. But more or less, you find a majority being in the rank of 28 to around 50. So they are not fully corrupt. Fully corrupt is where you get a ranking of less than 20. Anybody with a ranking of about 25 to around 45 to 40, 40 45 to 50 are mostly those that have a moderate rate of corruption as such. So India has such in this particular in this particular corruption perception index ranks at 41, and China also has a very similar ranking of 41 as such. So other than that, we don't have any. concerted or collective effort. Transparency International is a private organization that takes up this particular exercise, and based on that, when you are going to different countries of the world and when you are making your doing your research of choosing the right country to go, one of the factors that you can keep in mind is to look up this particular ranking list and find out, whether it's a whether you're going to a country which is very similar to your country's attitude and dealing when it comes to ethical environment, or is it very different as such, and accordingly you can actually make that particular decision. What are the most ethical issues that generally that are seen in international business are issues when it comes to employment practices, because when you have three different countries in the world, like the developed, developing, and the least developed countries, the employment legislations or the labor legislations in these particular countries could be a lot more different. So, so when you look at countries in the developed world, they have a very streamlined practice of employment, and they also have laws that are very strict and stringent and do not permit a lot of do not permit room for a lot of unethical or corrupt practices to be followed when it comes to environmental, or when it comes to employment related aspects, and when it comes to other aspects such as other forms of corruption and so on. On the other hand, when you look at developing and least developed countries, that's where they are still in this stage of progressing, and not much of exposure when it comes to unethical practices. And so that is where their rules and practices may not be developed enough, or they may not be very strict and stringent enough. So what happens is that is where a lot of developed countries in the world make use of this advantage of the developing and the least developed countries, because the rules are not so strict and stringent like the way it happens in their own countries. So let's say, for example, a lot of businesses that come from the West are not permitted to do a lot of things in their particular business. But when they come to developing and least developed countries, they realize that it is possible for them to do it here because the laws are not very strict and stringent. So they make use of the various loopholes in business. So you have employment. So the most common issues that we have are with respect to employment practices and exploitation of labor in developed and least developed countries. And secondly, a lot of environmental regulations, as I said, environmental regulations and carbon footprinting practices, and and all the recycling form of resources, and governments, what do you say, instructions when it comes to use of resources and disposal of waste or effluents, or use of groundwater. All of these are environmental practices that are very stringent in the developed world, and it may not be the same when it comes to developing and least developed countries. And that's where uh, you know companies could take advantage of a not so very stringent sort of a legal environment. Thirdly, corruption. And fourth is you have social responsibility of multinational corporations. What is the extent to which they have to do something or do their bit for society? Mostly unethical practices are commonly seen in these four areas. The other unethical issues that a company will have to deal with is bribery. Secondly, they might have to deal with conflict of interest when a business is indulging in a particular business activity where they also have an interest or they have a stake. And so that could lead to favoritism, and that could lead to decisions that go in favor of those companies that are very much part of their business network. So that could give room to favoritism. Thirdly, you could have unethical practices. We have this famous Rajat Gupta's case from Goldman Sachs, the director who was imprisoned for insider trading, for leaking secret information that was discussed in the board of directors meeting at Goldman Sachs to a hedge fund investor who later on used that information to make a fortune for himself. Fourth, you have accumulation of profits illegally by not ensuring that the returns go to the stakeholders in the right manner. Fifth, you could have misrepresentation of information, financial statements or reports. That's where we have the famous Satyam case where um, the financial statements were fudged or the financial statements were window dressed for a period of about 7 to 8 years, and the CEO of the company Ramalingam Raju was involved in a fictitious accounting and thereby putting Satyam into a deep crisis. And today you don't have this company called Satyam anymore, because of what the CEO and a group of people who had vested interests, did, and their corrupt practices ended up a very famous company called Satyam. Uh, Sixth, you could have an unethical practice called coercion, forcing certain stakeholders or certain leaders and managers, forcing them to take decisions by inducing them or trying to bribe them through gifts or forcing them or threatening them could also be another means that is employed in many countries which are very corrupt. And then you could have unfair discrimination where um, discrimination of people, businesses, and clients and customers could be done very irrationally, or could be done keeping a vested interest in mind, or could be done in a manner that is devoid of any sort of ethics. And then giving political gifts and donations are also very much there. If you want a favorable uh, decision to come in your favor from from business partners or from companies that you are entering into a deal with, or from government officials, or from governments that are in power, or from ministers who are able to uh, um, make decisions that will favor. So that is where you have this the example of the 2G scam, the 2G telecom scam that broke out, where the telecom minister was bribed heavily by all these telecom companies which expected a favorable decision in terms of spectrum allocation, and that is what gave rise to the 2G scam. And we have seen what it led to, and then the kind of consequences that companies and the members of the government, including the minister, had to face as such. So these are uh, certain other unethical practices that generally companies in international business will have to deal with. So, going by those very important decisions, ethics and employment practices. So, some of the issues that a company will have to deal with when work conditions in a host nations are clearly poorer to those in the multinational home nation. What standards will a particular company apply? Let's say, for example, a business from Canada, a garment manufacturing business from Canada, decides to set up a production unit in Bangladesh, right? Now, as you understand, the laws in Canada, the um, of employment laws and the set of rules that they have to follow when in terms of hiring, in terms of working conditions, in terms of wages and salaries, in terms of bonuses, incentives, and then the number of hours that employees will have to work. Now all of that is very stringent in Canada because the laws are very strict over there, and any manufacturer or any business that is found to be breaching or breaking those laws is very severely dealt with. Now, when this Canadian company comes to Bangladesh and sets up a garment manufacturing unit, you understand here it's not that very strict. The employment laws may not be that very strict and stringent, and there could be a lot of loopholes. And this particular company may find it very easy to do business here because it's very easy to hire people, to fire people, and put them to work in very poor and inhumane working conditions, or make them work for about 12 to 13 hours unregulated, make them work without giving them breaks or without giving them incentives. Anything of that sort is not questioned here um, um, because we're dealing with people of a poor country who are naturally poor and uneducated, and the governments are not too very keen on trying to make those necessary changes to help these people to know their rights, and rules are not very strict enough for these foreign companies to apply. So in those cases, will the Canadian company follow the Canadian standards in Bangladesh, or is it going to go by uh, the standards that are there in the host country, and feel happy that as long as we are following the host country's standards, and then if the law is not very strict, let's take advantage of it. And I mean, that's the right way of doing it. Or are they going to bring about a certain ethical practice, even if a particular government or a particular country and society does not have a very good ethical practice, but since you are a very responsible company and since you follow ethics in your country, are you going to bring in something on your own, initiate something voluntarily that may not be an accepted practice in in that particular host country or in that particular society? The second issue that we will be looking at is in terms of how businesses deal with environmental pollution. So, should a multinational company feel free to pollute in a developing nation if doing so does not break any laws? So, what environmental regulations in host nations are when environmental regulations in host nations are far inferior to those of the home nation, ethical issues will definitely come um, to a discussion. So, will an MNC do this? Right, so that is where we have this very famous case of the 2002 Plachimida case of Coca-Cola, which set up its manufacturing or bottling plant in this particular place called Plachimida in Kerala. After it was given permission to set up its manufacturing unit, it used groundwater to such a rampant extent that the water table was upset, and water was not available in that particular district for farmers for farming. So that is when the protest groups, the NGOs, and then the farmers agitated, and they wanted this particular coke plant to be closed down. So. So that was one allegation of groundwater not being available, and secondly was high content of pesticide also that was used was also another allegation. So that, and then the effluents were let into the ground, into the streams, and that polluted the rest of the other water resource that was available in that particular plant. So if you look at Coke as a very international company, as a company that's coming from United States, a country that is known for stringent of laws and has of rules that make sure that every company acts in a very responsible manner when it comes to dealing with environment and contributing for environmental growth. Now, here is an example of a company that comes to a country like India and takes advantage of inferior environmental regulations and misuses it. So that is when host countries, when the laws of a host country are not very stringent and does not put a lot of restrictions on a multinational company coming from a developed world. That's where there is room for unethical practices in this particular area. Third aspect, yes, we talk about ethics and corruption. So is it ethical to make payments to government officials to secure businesses? Right? So in the United States, we have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that forbids the practice of paying bribes to foreign government officials in order to gain business. So uh, paying of bribes, giving a bribe and taking a bribe is a is a crime, and it's also a crime in developing and least developed countries. Most countries have laws like that, including India, but nobody gives heed to the law, or nobody takes the law very seriously. And this is mostly done by multinational corporations, is to have their way in terms of the decisions that they want the government to favor. So this mostly happens wherever the business is very highly regulated. So wherever governments have a huge say in terms of permitting and not permitting businesses, right? So when you look at the model of capitalism, in the model of capitalism that United States and Canada follow, they follow a practice where the government does not intervene in business. So does not the government does not regulate businesses, or uh, does not act as a body that's going to allow and disallow businesses. So they play very minimal role when it comes to doing a business. So business is purely the prerogative of private companies, private entrepreneurs. So they decide what is right and what is good for them, and they go ahead doing businesses. and government only plays the role of a facilitator or only as a supportive agency. So there's very little that the government or the government officials can do in that kind of a scenario. But when you straightly come to a country like India, which follows a mixed economy model, right? So that's where the government plays a very important role because uh, uh, here businesses are largely regulated because we follow this policy of protectionism because we want to ensure that the domestic entrepreneurs and domestic companies are not affected by foreign companies and multinational corporations that come from developed countries of the world. So in order to uh, protect these, that's where we regulate. So that's where the government acts like a watchdog or acts like a body that's going to decide what is right and what is wrong, what is allowed, what it is allowed. So that's where you have regulations coming in place, and all government officials will be the ones who will decide whether what should be regulated, what business activity should be regulated and is regulated, and accordingly licenses, permits, and other sort of decisions and instructions are given. So whenever you have the role of the government being very prominent in business decisions, so that is when there is room for a very high level of corruption. That is what you see in most Asian countries, in most Latin American countries, and most African countries, because the role of the government is very prominent, and you need to grease the palms of these government ministers and officials to ensure that you do that. So in India, we have the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, which is an equivalent of the foreign car practices. So whenever multinational companies are found to be indulging in unethical practices, accumulating profits, and laundering money as such, so those will be tried according to laws that are equivalent in those countries. The fourth aspect that we will look at is, yes, we're looking at social responsibility. Do multinational corporations have a responsibility to give back to society that enable them to grow and succeed? So we understand that's also a very debatable aspect because it's divided. But right now the debate does not hold good because 2% of the profits that a particular company in India has to make, according to the amendment that was brought into the Companies Act, 2% of the profits will have to be set aside for corporate social responsibility activities. So, will an MNC, is the MNC responsible to give back to society what they earn from that particular country and society? So, the concept of social responsibility refers to the idea that business people should take social benefits into account when making business decisions, and that there should be a belief in decisions that have both economic as well as social benefits as such. So that is where multinational companies are expected to act in a very responsible manner. They just not are only to look at the economic benefits of making profits, but they also have to ensure that they do their bit for society, that they contribute for the development of infrastructure or development uh, of a community in their neighborhood, or development of any of those activities that the government wants the MNCs to collaborate with the government through a public-private partnership as such. So that is where an MNC is to act very responsible and show their bit of commitment for the host country, and that is when they will be able to win over the government or be able to create a positive impression in the minds of the consumers in society, because the host country citizens are the consumers, and those businesses, the MNC's business exist in those countries is of the because those businesses and their brands and products are patronized by the consumers and citizens of this particular country. So to give back is very noble, and that's what MNCs will have to think about in terms of their CSR activities. So what are the roots of unethical behavior? So when we look at what are the areas where unethical practices are quite common, we need to ask this question as to what makes managers behave in an unethical manner, what makes multinational corporations and firms behave in an unethical manner. So managerial behavior is largely influenced by personal ethics, decision making processes, organizational culture, leadership, and very unrealistic expectations, performance expectations that is placed by the companies. So let's look at all of that a little in detail. So as I told you, yeah, those are the roots of unethical behavior. So Individuals and companies, indulge in unethical behavior is mostly because of these listed out reasons. So, personal ethics, business ethics reflect personal ethics, the generally accepted principles of right and wrong leading to the conduct of individuals. So, there are two forms of ethics that we are looking at. One is personal ethics and professional ethics. Personal ethics are a set of ethical behavior or ethical character that is possessed by individuals. So every individual uh, is a good person or a bad person. So every individual learns personal ethics, and that personal ethics and integrity is what that individual brings to his or her business, or uses that in that role and responsibility that he or she plays. So largely, if you see companies, if companies are ethical, it is because of the ethics that is displayed by the leaders of the company, right? If companies are unethical, it is mostly because of the personal ethics of the leader that influences those companies to become unethical. And then the moment the employees in your organization or the lower down order looks up to the leader, and the leader himself endorses unethical practices or corrupt practices, then automatically the message goes down, and then every employee within the organization, or all the positions in the hierarchy within your organization, will also tend to follow the corrupt and unethical practice route in order to do their thing. So, emphasis on personal ethics is very important. Professional ethics is that discipline that talks about following ethics in all the business decisions that we take and then we make, and then we ensure the integrity and the ethical environment of the company remains quite intact. The second reason why companies um, exhibit unethical behavior. So there are studies that show that business people may behave unethically because they fail to ask the relevant question as to whether is this decision or action ethical. So very often decisions that are made in business are always made keeping the profit in mind, and then the maximum benefit that has to go to the stakeholders. We very rarely tend to ask this question whether we are doing the right thing. So when decisions that are taken are not just seen from the profit making point of view, but are seen from a societal benefit point of view and also from an ethical point of view, that is when decisions can be that is when a lot of corrupt and unethical practices of the organization can be stopped, only when we start asking whether this particular question, whether this particular action or decision of ours is ethical. Another thing that we should remember is decision making in an organization is happens on a consensus. It's always a group that decides. So every time a decision that is taken by a majority may be good for the organization, but what the majority decides may not often be ethical or may not often be fair. And whatever a minority is opposing, per se, a minority directors in the board are disagreeing with this particular decision because it's not fair or it is not ethical. And if that is ignored, and if the rule of the majority goes on to become the decision, so that is when many organizations find themselves in a tight spot later on when they are caught for unethical practices. So that's a point that we need to keep in mind, not just look at the benefit that's going to come to the company in terms of profits, but also look at it in terms of whether we are doing the right thing and whether that is bound by a climate of ethics. The third aspect is organization culture. Unethical behavior is a set of attitudes and beliefs and a set of practices that are followed in an organization. So, which is what is the fabric? What is the ethical fabric of your organization? If your organization follows a very high degree of ethical climate, or follows a very high degree of ethical code of conduct in all forms of businesses, be it very minor, be it a very minor thing or a major thing, there's nothing called small and bigger, there's nothing called minor or major. Everything is taken upon very seriously. So when ethics is a part of your culture, and when there is zero tolerance that the leaders of your organization show for mistakes or corrupt practices, and are firmly dealing with managers and leaders and executives who deal with um, who are often caught for unethical practices or breaching rules or laws, then they should be dealt with very seriously. So one particular company that I want to highlight at this point of time is this company called Infosys. There are numerous occasions where Infosys has taken a uh, very firm decision in removing employees from their organization who have shown unethical practices, and these examples are not just related to business or executing their roles and responsibilities, but these are related to things that are non-business. When an individual employee, when an infosician has done something wrong in his own personal capacity that has nothing to do with his job, but still the organization has taken a very firm decision on ousting that employee, sending an email to all the employees telling that such kind of corrupt practices will not be tolerated by a company called Infosys. So that is where firms like Infosys bring about this particular culture, and that becomes a part of their environment as such. Fourthly, we're looking at leadership. As I told you, it is very important that the leaders of the organization must stand up as role models. So if a firm's leaders fail to act in an ethical manner, then all the employees may not act ethically. So that's where the employees of an organization, or all the hierarchical members in your organization, are always looking up to the CEO and the leader. And if the CEO and the leader act ethically, and they drive home the point, and they show drive home the point that ethics is more important, doing the right thing in the right way is more important than profit making or trying to get a higher market share. If they set those kind of examples, and if they show zero tolerance towards unethical practices, or actions that are unethical, or actions that are corrupt, then the message goes home quite well. And then obviously effective leadership or ethical leadership can definitely influence the organization climate, and the organization climate can go on to become a lot more ethical, and your organization in the long run can reap the benefits of being a very highly ethical and a very upright kind of a company. So the last decision that we are looking at is unrealistic performance expectations. So which means when you ask this question as to what makes executives, managers, and leaders in companies to become very corrupt, why do they take this route? So if you talk to all these executives and leaders and managers of caught in unethical practices, so they will very often come out with this particular point and say that their hands were tied, or they were told by their leaders or managers, their higher ups, to act in this particular manner, or they will simply say that their targets and expectations that the organization put forth on them, or the demands that they put forth on them, was so unrealistic that it was not possible for them to fulfill those demands and expectations in a very realistic or in a very ethical manner. And that is why they had to resort to shortcuts, and that is why they had to resort to unethical practices, and indulge in a lot of corrupt forms to match up to that particular target. So that is one common reason that we've seen around all those companies that have indulged in unethical practices. So that's a point that we've got to very much keep in mind. So when we are doing the goal setting and setting goals and objectives for the organization as well as for the jobs in question, we must make sure that those expectations and demands are very much realistic. So, with those points, we are coming to the end of this particular topic on ethics in international business. So, those are those very areas that we discuss. So, for a multinational corporation, when it moves from one country to another country, it should maintain an ethical environment and an ethical climate, because every time you go to different countries of the world and you keep changing your decisions according to the ethical climate of that particular country, depending on whether corruption is allowed or not allowed, then uh, you are giving yourself you're putting yourself into a lot of difficulty as such, because there's nothing very firm about what you are going to do, and that's where you start losing your business integrity, and in the long run it can hurt, especially when you get caught. Two examples that I want to bring in: one is the example of the Johnson and Johnson company that was caught for the wrong implants that they did in the US and various customers, and today they are facing flack for it. Another company is Volkswagen. which fudged up on their emission testing norms so that they could so that the test reports could show a very lower reading, and then they will be permitted to sell those model of cars. And today they find themselves in a very difficult spot, and they've lost that image that they had, and all that good work that these companies and the previous leaders of these companies had built to build that reputation for those firms is today lost. And all that reputation has gone down the drain because of just one mistake that you do. So that is what we've got to keep in mind. So you can go on as long as you don't get caught, but once you are caught, you lose reputation, and everything that you've done can backfire. So those are these are cases for us that we need to learn and understand. It's not that you, as a firm, will have to face it yourself and see how to come out of it. But these examples of good companies that have seen benefits for themselves, and those bad companies that have gone the unrealistic, unethical route and find themselves in a problem. So those cases are what we firms need to see and understand, and then develop. So that's the part that we need to understand. So that's where companies need to decide and figure out a way out as such. So with that, we come to the end of this particular topic. Thank you.